The message arrived at 3:17 a.m. Moscow time. Ambassador Elena Okafor-Singh was sleeping in her small cabin aboard the space station hearth when her communicator chimed. It wasn't the soft ping of a routine update, nor the double pulse of a standard urgent message. It was the emergency override signal, one she had heard only twice in her entire career. Both times they had been drills. She sat up in the darkness, her heart hammering before her eyes had even fully opened. "Ambassador," said the voice of her aide, Tamako. Even through the tiny speaker, Elena could hear that something was profoundly wrong. "You need to go to the operations center immediately." "What happened?" There was a pause that lasted far too long. "Everything," Tamako said. Elena pulled on her uniform and hurried through the corridors of the hearth. The station was the diplomatic heart of the Galactic Accord, a massive structure floating in neutral space between 12 major trade routes. On a normal night, the corridors would be teeming with life. Delegates from 100 species walking, swimming, or crawling to late-night meetings. Merchants arguing in languages that sounded like music, thunder, or breaking glass. The air itself usually carried the mixed scent of 1,000 different worlds. Tonight, the corridors were empty and silent, a silence that felt as if something had been cut out of the universe. She reached the operations center and shoved the door open. Inside, there was chaos. Human staff clustered around screens showing only static. Her communications officers were screaming into devices that gave no response, and in the middle of it all stood Tamako, her face pale, her hands trembling. "The Nexus is offline," Tamako said. Elena stared at her. "What do you mean offline?" "I mean gone. Everything. Every repeater, every beacon, every comms channel. The entire Nexus network went offline 47 minutes ago, and it isn't coming back." Elena felt the floor shift beneath her feet, even though the station's gravity was perfectly stable. The Nexus wasn't just a communication network, it was everything. It was the system that linked 4,000 interstellar civilizations across the galaxy. It managed trade routes. It calculated safe paths for faster-than-light travel. It coordinated food shipments between worlds that could not feed themselves. It managed banking systems, medical databases, and emergency response networks. It was the backbone, the nervous system, the beating heart of galactic civilization. It had operated without interruption for over 60 years, and now it was gone. "That's impossible," Elena said, because it was the only thing she could say. "I know," Tamako replied, "but it happened anyway." Over the next few hours, the full picture came together like broken glass, slowly forming a horrific image. The Nexus hadn't just failed, it hadn't been attacked. Something far stranger and far more terrible had happened. The Nexus had shut itself down. Repeaters across the galaxy had powered off in a precise sequence, one after another, like someone blowing out candles along an unimaginably long corridor. Navigation beacons upon which ships depended for safe travel flickered out. Communication arrays folded. And then, most horrifyingly, the Nexus began actively destroying its own infrastructure. Stations that had floated in space for millennia engaged their emergency thrusters and crashed into nearby moons. Data archives containing the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of civilizations were wiped. It was not a glitch, it was a self-liquidation. By morning, the consequences were already catastrophic. Elena stood in the Chamber of Accord, the vast, circular hall where representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy met to govern, and looked at the screens lining the walls. Each screen should have shown a live feed from a member world. Now, most of them were black. The few that still functioned showed images that made her stomach churn. On the homeworld of the Dry Mori, millions of beings were falling in the streets. The Dry Mori were a hive-mind species. They did not think as individuals. Their consciousness had been shared through a neural network integrated into the Nexus thousands of years ago. When the Nexus died, their minds were torn apart. Millions of Dry Mori fell where they stood, screaming without sound. Their bodies twitched, their eyes were blank. They weren't dead, they were something worse. They were alone inside their own heads for the first time in their species' history, and they didn't know how to live with it. On the trade world of Ket Wasser, the automated food distribution system had stopped. Ket Wasser was a desert planet that imported 98% of its food through Nexus-managed supply chains. Within hours, the markets were empty. By the end of the day, riots had begun. Planetary security forces, which relied on Nexus coordination to function, collapsed. The last image from Ket Wasser showed a burning city, and then the screen went dark. The Shokun Empire, which had ruled 100 star systems with graceful precision for 1,000 years, disintegrated overnight. The Shogun were a species that valued order above all else. Their entire government was built on a chain of command that ran through the Nexus. When that chain broke, every regional governor declared independence. By the end of the first day, 14 separate Shogun factions were already threatening one another with weapons. Elena watched all of this and felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She had spent 12 years as Earth's ambassador to the Accord. She had fought for humanity's seat at the table. She had argued, negotiated, and sometimes begged other species to take humans seriously. And in all that time, she had learned one fundamental truth about the galaxy. It was a beautiful, ancient, majestic machine. And like all machines, it had one single point of failure: the Nexus. Every civilization in the Accord had built itself around the Nexus, not just used it, but grown into it, like a tree growing around a wire fence, until the fence became part of the trunk. The Vale had outsourced their agricultural knowledge to the Nexus 10,000 years ago. Why learn to farm when the Nexus could manage production more efficiently? The Dry Mori had integrated their neural networks with the Nexus because it made their hive mind stronger. The Shogun had outsourced their government structure to the Nexus because it eliminated the messiness of independent decision-making. Every species had traded something essential in exchange for the ideal efficiency of the Nexus. And now that it was gone, they had nothing to lean on. Except for one. Elena's communicator beeped. She looked down and saw a message from Earth, from Secretary General Tomas Herrera. Ambassador, confirm status. Earth systems are operational. Repeat, Earth systems are operational. What is the situation? She almost laughed. Just a little. Earth was fine. Of course, Earth was fine, because humans had never trusted the Nexus, not fully, not the way other species had. That was one of the reasons humanity had been the laughingstock of the galaxy for 100 years. When humanity first joined the Accord, the elder species offered them full integration into the Nexus. It was presented as a gift, the greatest gift a young species could receive: access to the most powerful system ever created. Ambassador Viide had said with great warmth at the time, "You will never need to struggle again." And humanity had responded, "Thanks, but we'd like our own systems to keep working, just in case." The galaxy had been confused, then amused, then openly mocking. Humans kept their old radio towers. They maintained their own satellite networks. They grew their own food on their own farms, even though the Nexus could deliver better food faster and cheaper. They built their own ships with their own navigation systems, even though Nexus beacons made such things redundant. They kept paper records, physical libraries, backup generators, emergency shelters, redundant systems layered on top of one another. The Vale had a saying about humans that became famous across the galaxy. They are the species that keeps candles next to a fusion reactor. It hadn't been a compliment. But tonight, the fusion reactor was dead, and the candles were still burning. Elena composed her reply to Secretary General Herrera. She kept it short and factual. Nexus is gone. Galaxy is in freefall. Most major civilizations are already in crisis. Hearth itself is running on backup power, human backup power, she noted with grim satisfaction. She ended with one line: "They will need us." She sent the message and then stood alone in the empty chamber of Accord for a long moment. The large, curved walls that usually glowed with the light of 1,000 connected worlds were dark. The seats where ambassadors from across the galaxy sat, argued, and sometimes shouted at each other were empty. The air scrubbers hummed quietly, the only sound in a room that had once been the most bustling place in the known universe. Her communicator beeped again. Then it didn't stop. She looked down and saw messages arriving one after another, then by the dozen, then by the hundreds. They were coming from everywhere, from every corner of the galaxy. Some were in languages she recognized. Some were in languages she had never seen. Some weren't even words. Just sounds desperate, sounds transmitted blindly into the void by beings who no longer had the technology to form proper sentences. But the meaning in every one of them was the same. Help us. Please, help us. We are alone and don't know what to do. Help us. Elena read the messages flooding her screen until her eyes ached and her throat felt tight. These were species that had looked down on humanity, species that had laughed at human redundancy, species that had called humans primitive, paranoid, and unnecessarily stubborn. species that had voted against giving Earth a full seat on the Council just 15 years ago because they didn't believe humans could contribute anything meaningful to galactic civilization. And now, they were begging. She felt many things in that moment. A small, human part of her felt satisfaction. A darker part felt anger. But the largest part of her, the part that grew up on a small farm in Nigeria, where her grandmother had taught her that the measure of a person is what they do when someone who has hurt them falls, that part felt only one responsibility. She opened a channel to Earth. Secretary General Herrera, this is Ambassador Okafor-Singh. I am forwarding you all incoming distress signals. There are hundreds. By morning there will be thousands. The galaxy is falling apart, and we are the only ones with the lights still on. She paused. What do we do? Herrera's response took several minutes. When it came, his voice was heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. We will do what humans have always done, Ambassador. We will help. But even as he said it, she knew it wouldn't be simple. Nothing ever was. Earth had resources. Yes, Earth had working systems. Earth had food, ships, and people who knew how to build things with their own hands. But Earth was one world, one small, stubborn world among 4,000 civilizations that were all collapsing at the same time. The help would cost them. It would stretch them thin. It might break them. And there would be those on Earth who would ask the obvious question, why should we? She pushed the thought away. There would be time for debate later. Right now, beings were dying, worlds were going dark, and the only light left in the galaxy came from a little blue planet no one had ever taken seriously. Outside the Chamber of Accord, the stars continued to burn. They didn't care that the Nexus was gone. They didn't care about civilizations, empires, or trade routes. They burned because that is what stars do. They burned without reason, without purpose, without anyone's instructions. Elena thought about that. She thought about how humans had looked at those stars for 100 years and seen not just light, but possibility. How they had built boats and crossed oceans not because it was efficient, but because they wanted to see what was on the other side. How they had crawled out of every catastrophe, every war, every plague, every collapse, not because they were strong, but because they simply refused to stay down. The galaxy had collapsed overnight. It had collapsed because it had forgotten how to stand on its own feet. It had given everything to the machine, and then the machine went away. But Earth remembered. Earth had never stopped remembering. In the darkness of the conquered chamber, Elena Okafor-Singh straightened her uniform, inhaled, and began to answer the messages one by one, world by world. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have enough ships, food, or people. She didn't have the ancient technology of the elder species or the vast resources of fallen empires. She had something else, something the galaxy had considered a weakness for 100 years. She had the stubbornness to try anyway. And far, far away, on the other side of the galaxy, in a place no living species knew, something ancient and patient watched the little blue world with great interest. It had seen this test played out 1,000 times before. It had seen civilizations fall and never rise. It had seen the strong devour the weak and then devour themselves. But it had never seen this. It had never seen such a small and young species look into the darkness and say, no. It watched, and for the first time in 100 years, it wondered, what happens next? 72 hours after the death of the Nexus, Captain Duran Wangi stood on the bridge of the EFS Persistence and stared at the stars. The ship was old. It was one of Earth's heavy cargo haulers, originally built to transport grain and construction materials between human colonies. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty. Its hull was scratched and dented after years of honest work, and the engine emitted a low groan that the engineering team had long ago stopped trying to fix. They just called it the old man's cough and carried on. Now, Persistence was in the first emergency fleet Earth had ever sent beyond its borders. There were only 12 ships, carrying food, water, medicine, generators, and 300 volunteers who had signed up within hours of the call. They were headed to the home of the Veil, Oashin, one of the oldest and most prestigious civilizations in the galaxy. The Veil had once ruled an empire stretching over 200 star systems. They were tall, graceful beings with silvery skin and 4 arms. They lived for 500 years. They had mastered technologies humans could barely comprehend. They built monuments that floated in the upper atmospheres of gas giants. They composed music that could make other creatures weep at its beauty. And now, they were starving. Duran read the briefing report for the 3rd time. Without the Nexus, the Veil food production system had collapsed completely. It turned out the Veil hadn't actually grown their own food for 8,000 years. The Nexus managed everything: automated farms, processing plants, distribution networks. The Veil themselves had forgotten how agriculture worked, not just the details, but the concept. There was an entire generation of creatures who didn't understand where food came from. "How can a civilization forget how to feed itself?" asked Lieutenant Priyarma, the ship's doctor, reading the same report over Duran's shoulder. "The same way a human forgets how to walk if they spend their whole life in a wheelchair," Duran said. "You don't lose the ability all at once. You lose it slowly, one little piece at a time, until one day you look down and realize you don't remember how your legs work." Priyarma was silent for a moment. "That's horrific." "Yes," Duran agreed, "it is." Back on Earth, the debates predicted by Ambassador Okafor-Singh were already heating up. The United Star Council of the UN had been in emergency session for 2 days straight, and the arguments were only growing louder. Secretary General Tomas Herrera stood in the center. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes that could turn as hard as stone when necessary. He had grown up in a small town in Colombia, where his mother ran a clinic with whatever she could find. He understood scarcity. He understood the urge to hoard when times were tough, and he understood why it was wrong. "We have a responsibility," he told the council. "The galaxy is in crisis. We can help. Therefore, we must help." Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the other side of the chamber. She was a decorated officer with 30 years of service. She had defended human colonies from pirate raids. She navigated political minefields with the same precision with which she navigated asteroid fields. And she was not convinced. "With respect, Secretary General. Responsibility to whom? To species that spent a century laughing at us? To the Veil, who blocked our application for full council membership 3 times? To the Shokun, who publicly called humanity a waste of carbon?" She paused to let the words sink in. "We have 8 billion people on Earth and another 2 billion in our colonies. If we send our food reserves into the galaxy, what happens when our own people go hungry?" The chamber was divided. On one side, those who agreed with Herrera argued that this wasn't just a moral choice, but a strategic one. If humanity helped rebuild the galaxy, it would win the respect that centuries of diplomacy hadn't achieved. On the other side, Tanaka's supporters pointed out that Earth's resources were limited, the galaxy was vast, and there were 4,000 civilizations all collapsing at once. Even if Earth gave everything it had, it wouldn't be enough. There was also a third voice in the debate, quieter than the others, but growing stronger every day. It came from people who looked at the situation and saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. The galaxy was on its knees. Earth was the only power left standing. Why not take advantage of this? Why not build a human empire while the competition was too weak to resist? This voice didn't have one leader. It lived in whispered conversations in hallways, in articles that carefully avoided the word empire while perfectly describing one. It was a shadow in the corner of every debate, a thought many had, but few were willing to say aloud. Herrera heard it, and it frightened him more than anything. "We are not conquerors," he said, his voice ringing through the chamber with a weight that silenced the room. "That is not who we are. That is not who we will become. We help because it is right. We help because we can, and we help because one day, when we are in trouble, we want to live in a galaxy that helps." The vote was close, closer than it should have been. But in the end, the council approved the relief missions. Earth would send food, medical supplies, and technical support to any world that asked. The price would be enormous. The risk would be real. But the decision was made, and the ships were sent. Persistence arrived at Oashin on the 5th day. Duran had seen photographs of the Veil's homeworld before. In those photos, it was stunning, a world of crystal towers and floating gardens, cities that rose from the ground like frozen music. The Veil were artists as much as engineers, and their world reflected that in every detail. What Duran saw through the viewport now was different. Without the Nexus, the floating gardens had collapsed, the anti-gravity systems failing. They had crashed into the surface, leaving massive scars on the landscape. The crystal towers were dark, the cities were silent, and on the landing pad where Persistence touched down, a crowd of Veil stood waiting. Duran expected anything. He expected hostility, perhaps, or cold dignity. The Veil were a proud species, and accepting help from humanity, the youngest, loudest, most chaotic species in the galaxy, would not have been easy. What he did not expect was the look in their eyes. He had seen that look before. He had grown up in Nairobi, and when he was 7, a massive flood had destroyed his neighborhood. He remembered standing in the ruins of his family's home, holding his younger sister's hand, waiting for the arrival of rescue teams. He remembered what his mother looked like when she finally saw the incoming helicopters, not relieved, not grateful, but something else, a raw look of a person who had been strong for as long as they could and had finally reached the end of their strength. That was the look on the faces of the Vale. He descended the ramp and was met by a Vale official named Saren Vel. Saren was tall, even by Vale standards, with silvery skin dulled by stress and 4 arms hanging at his sides as if they had forgotten their purpose. "Captain Wangi," Saren said. His voice was flat. His translator, one of the few devices that still worked, powered by a human-made battery, translated his words into cautious English. "We are grateful for your arrival." It was the hardest sentence Duran had ever heard anyone speak. "We are glad to be here," Duran replied. He kept his voice level and warm. No pity, no superiority. Just one person speaking to another. "We brought food, clean water, medical supplies, portable generators, and a team of agricultural engineers." Saron's eyes flickered at the last item. Engineers, agronomists, yes, people who know how to grow food. There was a silence. Saren looked at the human ship, this battered, ugly, groaning machine, and then at the ruins of his world. Towers that had once touched the clouds, gardens that had once floated in the sky, a civilization that was ancient when humanity was still learning to make fire. "We have not grown food ourselves for 8,000 years, Saren said quietly. "I know," Duran said. "That is why we are here." The first few days on Oashin were difficult. The Vael were cooperative but deeply uncomfortable. The presence of humans, these short-lived, rough-skinned, noisy creatures walking through their ancient cities, felt wrong to them on a level they couldn't easily express. It was as if a child had been invited into a museum to fix the paintings. The child might be helpful, but it didn't make the situation less humiliating. Duran understood this. He had been briefed on Vael psychology, and he had dealt with pride before. His grandmother was a fiercely independent woman who had refused all help after his grandfather died, even when she could barely walk. Duran knew the trick wasn't to offer help as charity, it was to offer it as partnership. So, instead of telling the Vael what to do, he asked them to tell him about their world, what the soil was like, what the climate cycle had been, what plants had once grown here before the Nexus took over. The Vael didn't know the answers anymore, but the questions sparked curiosity, and curiosity, Duran found, was stronger than pride. Human engineers and agronomists set up a small experimental field outside the main city. They used hand tools and simple irrigation technologies that would have been recognizable to a farmer from ancient Mesopotamia. The Vael watched with a mixture of wonder and horror. A species that had manipulated the quantum structure of matter for thousands of years now watched as humans shoved seeds into the dirt with their fingers. "Is this really how your species produces food?" asked a young Vael named Kale, who had been assigned as an assistant to the human team. She had never seen a plant growing outside of a decorative exhibit. "One of the ways," said Maria Santos, the lead agricultural engineer. She was a short, tanned woman from Brazil with dirt constantly under her fingernails and a smile that could light up a dark room. "We have more advanced methods, but advanced methods need infrastructure. And right now, you have no infrastructure, so we start with this." "With the dirt," KL said. She didn't speak with contempt. She spoke with something close to awe. "With the dirt," Maria confirmed. "Everything starts with the dirt." While rescue efforts were underway on the surface, something else was happening in the space around Oashin. A team of Earth engineers, led by a specialist named Chen Wei, had been sent to study the remains of a Nexus repeater floating in orbit. The station was one of thousands scattered across the galaxy, massive structures that served as nodes in the Nexus network. When the Nexus shut down, most of these stations self-destructed, but this one, for reasons unknown, had simply gone into sleep mode. Chen and her team docked with the station and spent 3 days exploring it. What they found inside was deeply disturbing. The station's systems were dead, but its memory banks were partially intact. Chen was a specialist in alien technology, one of the few humans who had studied the architecture of the Nexus. She had always been told that the Nexus was a tool very advanced, very old, but still just a tool that ancient species had built to serve them. What she found in the memory banks told a different story. The shutdown hadn't been a glitch. It hadn't been an attack. The Nexus had followed a protocol, a set of instructions buried so deep in its architecture that no living species even knew they existed. The protocol had a name, written in a language that predated every known civilization in the galaxy. Chen Wei's translation software struggled with it, but eventually provided a rough equivalent, the Crucible. She found records showing that this wasn't the first time the protocol had been activated. It had happened before, many times at regular intervals stretching back further than the age of most stars. Every time the same thing happened. The Nexus supported galactic civilization for roughly 100 years, long enough for every species in the galaxy to become completely dependent on it, and then it deliberately shut down, and the civilization collapsed. Every time, the result was the same. Total destruction, no recovery. Chen stared at the data for a long time. Then she contacted Captain Wangi. "Captain," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "The Nexus didn't break. It was designed to do this. Someone built it to intentionally collapse. And whoever they were, they've been doing this for millions of years." Duran received this information while sitting in his cabin aboard the Persistence. He read Chen's report twice. He looked at the data. He looked at the translation of the ancient word Crucible and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control system. Someone had built the Nexus not as a gift to the galaxy, but as a trap, a test, and every civilization that had ever taken the test had failed. He forwarded the report to Earth with one note. "We need to understand what this means, and we need to understand it quickly." But even as the mystery deepened, life on Oashin continued. The seeds planted by the humans began to sprout. Small green shoots poked through the alien soil. The Veil gathered to watch their growth. And Duran saw in their faces something he hadn't seen before. Hope fragile, uncertain, barely alive. But it was there. Kale knelt by the sprouts and reached out one of her 4 arms to touch a tiny leaf. She was very careful, as if afraid it would break. "It's growing," she said quietly. "From nothing it's growing." "Not from nothing," Maria said. She knelt beside Kale and placed her hand on the dirt. "From this, from water, from light, from patience. That is all you need." "We didn't know," Kale said, her voice cracking. "We forgot." Maria placed her rough, tanned hand on Kale's silvery hand. "That's okay," she said. "Now you remember." And far, far away, across the ruined galaxy, on thousands of other worlds, similar scenes were playing out. Human ships were arriving at alien ports. Human hands were offering food to beings who towered over them. Human voices were explaining simple things. How to purify water, how to build a shelter, how to make fire to species who had once prided themselves on knowing such primitive skills. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. The galaxy was too big and too broken, and humanity was too small, but it was a beginning. And then, on the 7th day after the fall of the Nexus, Ambassador Okafor-Singh received a transmission that changed everything. It came from deep space, not from any known world, but from the galactic core, a region that no living species had ever explored. The signal was weak and fragmented, and the technicians at the hearth took hours to clean it up, enough to read. When they did, Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The message was written in the same ancient language that Chen Wei had found in the repeater, a language that predated every known civilization. The translation algorithms had mostly produced garbage, but one, developed by a human linguist specializing in dead languages, yielded a result. 3 words. The test began. Elena stood alone in the operations center and read the words again and again. The test began. Not a test, the test. As if there were only one, and as if every civilization that had ever existed in the galaxy had built itself toward this single moment. She thought of the Nexus, of how it was designed to create dependency, of how it was designed to collapse, of how every previous civilization had fallen and never risen again. And she thought of humanity of the candles next to the fusion reactor, of the species that had refused to give up its ability to struggle, of the small, stubborn, messy, chaotic world that never stopped doing everything the hard way. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the hard way was the point. She sent a message to Earth and to every human ship in the galaxy with one addition. The test began, and we are not going to fail it. 3 weeks after the death of the Nexus, the galaxy looked like a body that had lost its blood. The structures were still there, worlds, stations, cities, ships, but the life that had flowed through them was gone. And in that void, terrible things began to grow. Dr. Amina Yusuf arrived on the arid world of Vet Shal on a small medical transport ship. She was a xenopsychologist, one of the few humans who had dedicated her career to studying how alien minds worked. She was 43, tall and thin, with dark eyes that noticed everything and a quiet voice that somehow sounded heavier than a shout. For the last decade, she had studied the Dry Mori from a distance, writing papers about their hive mind that were respected in academic circles and ignored by everyone else. Now, everyone needed her. The Dry Mori were a species numbering about 9 billion individuals across 12 worlds, but the word individuals hadn't applied to them for thousands of years. The Dry Mori had evolved a natural telepathic ability, initially weak, good for short distances and simple feelings, but over the centuries, they had amplified it with technology. And when the Nexus arrived, they merged their telepathic network with the Nexus itself. The result was a hive mind of extraordinary power and beauty. 9 billion minds thinking together, dreaming together, creating together. When the Nexus died, that connection was instantly severed. 9 billion minds that had been one suddenly became 9 billion separate, isolated, terrified individuals. Most of them had never had a private thought in their lives, and they didn't know how to think alone. They didn't know who they were outside the collective. The result was mass psychosis on a scale no species had ever seen. Her shuttle landed on the outskirts of the largest city on Vetshal. The city was beautiful, or it had been beautiful. The Dry Mori built their cities in spirals, with buildings curved like shells and streets flowing like rivers. Everything was designed to be perceived collectively. Every angle was calculated to create harmonious thoughts in the shared mind. Now, the streets were filled with Dry Mori sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth, whispering to themselves. Some were screaming, some were perfectly silent, staring into nothing. Some had curled into tight balls and stopped moving altogether. Amina stepped off the shuttle and was met by a Dry Mori named Arurin. He was one of the few who was still functioning, barely. His hands were shaking, his eyes were wide and unfocused. He spoke in short, broken sentences, as if every word required a massive effort. "You, human doctor?" he said. "I am," Amina replied gently. "I am here to help." Arurin looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the look of a drowning person who sees a hand reaching toward them but doesn't believe it's real. "We are broken," he said. "We hear nothing. We are alone." "I know," Amina said. "Can you take me to the most severe cases?" He led her into the city. What she saw there would stay with her for the rest of her life. The Dry Mori weren't just confused or scared. They were experiencing something that had no analog in human psychology. Imagine you had spent your entire life as part of an ocean, every drop connected to every other drop, flowing together, feeling together, and then one morning you wake up and you are one drop of water falling in empty air without an ocean in sight. That was what 9 billion Dry Mori were experiencing simultaneously. Some had become aggressive, attacking anyone who approached, unable to process the sensation of touch from someone whose thoughts they couldn't feel. Others had gone in the opposite direction, desperately clinging to each other, pressing their bodies together as if physical contact could replace the mental connection they had lost. Some had simply ceased to function. Their minds had shut down, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of individual consciousness. Amina set up a field camp in what had once been a hall for collective meditation. She gathered her small team of human psychologists and began to work. She had no protocol for this. No textbook covered the treatment of mass psychological collapse in a former telepathic species. She had to create her approach from scratch, using everything she knew about human trauma, grief, and recovery. And that was when she realized what the key was. Because humans knew about trauma. Humans were experts in trauma. In some horrific sense, it was humanity's oldest skill. She started with dreams. She taught the functioning Dry Mori how to breathe, not the collective, synchronous breathing they had practiced as a hive mind, but individual breathing, slow, deliberate, one breath at a time. She taught them grounding techniques, how to focus on the physical sensations of their own bodies, their own feet on the ground, their own hands in front of their faces. She taught them that the voice inside their head was their own, and that it wasn't the enemy. "You are not broken," she told Arurin, sitting with him in the silence of the meditation hall while chaos raged outside. "You are learning something new. You are learning how to be yourselves." "I don't want to be myself," Arurin said. "I want to be us." "I understand," Amina said. "And perhaps one day you will find a way to return to that, but right now you need to learn how to be yourself. That is where it all begins." He looked at her with his large, dark eyes. "Have you always been alone inside your mind?" "Yes," Amina said. "Every human has been, from the start." "How do you stand it?" Amina thought about that question for a long time. She thought about her childhood in Mogadishu. She thought about her father, who had survived war and famine and still found the strength to sing songs to his children every night. She thought about her mother, who had worked 6-hour shifts in a clinic with no medicine and never stopped smiling at her patients. "We stand it because we choose to," she said. "Every day we choose to continue. It isn't easy. It was never intended to be easy. But we do it because the alternative is to give up, and humans are very bad at giving up." Ararin considered this. "Your species is strange." "Yes," Amina agreed. "We really are." While Amina worked on Vet Shal, the rest of the galaxy continued to fall apart. The Shogun Empire had splintered into 47 separate factions within the first 2 weeks. The Shogun were a martial species, disciplined and hierarchical, and without the Nexus, every regional commander declared independence to maintain their chain of command. Some tried to hold their territories, others tried to take territory from their neighbors. The first shots had already been fired. In the outer systems, piracy skyrocketed. Ships that had once traveled safely under the protection of the Nexus were now prey for anyone with a weapon and a lack of conscience. Trade convoys carrying food and supplies between worlds were raided. Some worlds, already starving, became desperate, and in the dark spaces between the stars, some species simply stopped trying. The Kelorn, peaceful artists who had lived for centuries in orbital habitats fully supported by the Nexus, lost everything when their life support systems failed. By the time the survivors were found drifting in the cold, their beautiful works of art floating around them like snow. Earth's resources were at their limit. Secretary General Herrera authorized the conversion of nearly a third of Earth's commercial fleet into emergency relief ships. Food reserves were depleting at a rate that caused logistics officers to panic. Human volunteers were scattered across hundreds of worlds, working until they collapsed. Some died, killed in riots or accidents, or simply from the strain of trying to do too much with too little. Admiral Tanaka, to her credit, didn't say, "I told you so." She simply submitted a revised budget request and recommended doubling the number of ships equipped with defensive armaments. "The galaxy," she noted in her report, "is becoming a dangerous place." But even as the galaxy burned, something remarkable was happening. On every world where humans arrived, something changed. It wasn't the physical situation that was still dire. It was something harder to measure but far more important. Alien species were starting to learn. On Oashin, the Veil were growing food, not well. The first harvest was tiny and uneven, and a Veil farmer would have made any human agricultural student cringe. But they were doing it with their own hands for the first time in 8,000 years. On Vet Shal, Auroran began teaching others the breathing techniques Amina had shown him. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a therapist. He was a former musician who had played in orchestras designed for a hive mind. But he learned the techniques and passed them on, and the circle of functioning dry mori slowly grew. On the border worlds of the Shogun, a human negotiator named James Achibe managed to convince 3 warring factions to stop shooting at each other long enough to share food. It wasn't peace, it was barely even a truce, but it was something. It was better than nothing. Senior Veil scientist Saran Vel, the same official who had met Duran on the landing pad with those painful words of gratitude, started studying human history. He requested access to Earth's historical archives, and humans granted it freely. He spent days reading about human wars, famines, plagues, and collapses. He read about the fall of Rome. He read about the Black Death. He read about 2 world wars. He read about climate change and the decades of crisis that followed. He read about every terrible thing that had ever happened to humanity. And then, he read about what followed: recovery, reconstruction, the stubborn, relentless, sometimes irrational refusal to admit that things couldn't get better. Well, he called a meeting of the Veil leaders, what was left of them, and delivered a speech that became famous across the galaxy. Not because it was elegant or poetic, although Saron was capable of both, but because it was honest, as the Veil hadn't been honest with themselves in a long time. "We laughed at them," he said, standing in a hall that had once glowed with the light of the Nexus and was now lit by human-made lanterns. "When they first joined the Accord, we looked at them and laughed. They were so young, so small, so fragile. They broke so easily, they died so quickly, they fought each other over things that seemed insignificant. And we thought, these creatures can teach us nothing." He paused and looked at the faces around him. Proud faces, ancient faces, faces that had spent centuries believing they were among the greatest creatures the galaxy had ever created. "We were wrong," he said. "We were so deeply, completely, horribly wrong." He held up a human device, a simple tablet loaded with historical records. I have spent the last 2 weeks reading the history of this little species, and what I found there shocked me more than the fall of the Nexus, because their history is a history of destruction. They break again and again and again. They break in ways that would have destroyed any other species. Wars killing millions, diseases wiping out continents, catastrophes changing their world. They have experienced more suffering in their short existence than we have in our long one. His voice grew softer, yet they were still here. Every time they break, they rebuild. Every time they fall, they get back up. Not because they are strong, they are not strong, not in the sense that we understand strength, but because they have something we do not, something we abandoned long ago when we handed our future to the Nexus. He put down the tablet. They remember how to struggle. They never forgot. And that is why, when the galaxy collapsed overnight, they were the only ones left standing. Not because they were prepared for this specifically, but because they had been preparing for catastrophe their entire existence. Every flood, every famine, every war, all of it was training. They didn't know it at the time, but their history made them the only species in the galaxy that knows how to survive when everything falls apart. He looked at his people. We called them the species that keeps candles next to a fusion reactor. We said it as an insult, but the fusion reactor is dead, and the candles are the only light left in the galaxy. We need to learn from them. We need to learn how to struggle again. We need to learn how to break and rebuild, because that is what survival looks like. Not perfection, not control, not the elegant systems we built and worshipped. Survival looks like dirt under your fingernails, seeds in the ground, and a stubborn refusal to lie down and die. In the room after his speech, there was silence. Then, slowly, the veil began to move. Not with their usual grace, clumsily, awkwardly, like children learning to walk. They moved toward the fields where the human engineers were working, knelt in the mud, and began to learn. And far, far away in the heart of the galaxy, Chen Wei's discovery was to lead to something even more extraordinary. A team of Earth deep space explorers, following the signal that Elena had received, had traveled toward the galactic center for 2 weeks. Their ship, the EFS Discovery, was the fastest in the human fleet, which meant it was still painfully slow by galactic standards, but it moved, and that was what mattered. They found the source of the signal on the edge of a region of space that no map had ever charted. There was a structure, not a station, not a planet, but something in between. It hung in space like a jewel the size of a moon, dark and silent, emitting a faint energy signal, pulsing like a heartbeat. Discovery approached cautiously. Captain Elena Vasquez, the mission commander, was not one to take risks without need. She ordered a full scan, checked weapon systems, and prepared for every possible scenario. She was not prepared for what actually happened. A door opened in the side of the structure, not a mechanical door, but something more organic, as if the structure itself had pulled back its skin to let them in. And through the opening came light, warm, golden, and unmistakably an invitation. Vasquez looked at her crew. Her crew looked at her. "Well," she said, "we didn't come this long way just to stand around and look at the door." They went inside. They found beings, not machines, not holograms. Living, breathing creatures unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. They were tall and luminous. Their bodies seemed to shift from solid to light. Their eyes were old, not just in age, but old the way mountains are old, the way rivers are old. They looked at the human crew with an expression that Vasquez took a long time to identify. "Surprise! You shouldn't be here," said one of them. Its voice was calm and deep, resonating not just in the air, but throughout the entire structure. No species has reached this place since the Crucible event. No species has been organized enough to send an exploration mission. Vasquez squared her shoulders. "We're full of surprises." The beings looked at her. Then, slowly, one of them made a gesture that could have been a smile. "Yes," it said, "we are beginning to understand that." They called themselves the Architects, and they had been watching the galaxy for a very, very long time. They confirmed what Chen had suspected. The Nexus was their creation. The Crucible was their design. Every 100,000 years, the Nexus supported a galactic civilization until that civilization became completely dependent. And then, the Nexus shut down. The architects called it thinning a test to see if any species in the galaxy retained the ability to survive without the system they had become dependent upon. Every previous civilization failed, the architects said. The pattern is always the same. Dependency grows, independence dies, And when the support is removed, the civilization collapses. We have watched this cycle repeat for longer than your species has existed. Why? Asked Vasquez. Why build something destined to be destroyed? The architect paused. Because a galaxy of dependent species is a galaxy waiting for death, not from us, but from anything. One catastrophe, one failure, and it all ends. Why? We built the Crucible to find species that are different. Species that retain their ability to survive independently. Species that can lead the galaxy toward genuine sustainability, not comfortable dependency. And when the silence followed, it was the loudest thing Vasquez had ever heard. No, the architect said. Until now, not a single species has remained standing after the start of the Crucible. It looked at Vasquez and her crew, these small, fragile, incredibly stubborn creatures who had traveled across the galaxy on a battered ship to knock on a door that no one was ever supposed to find. And in its ancient eyes, Vasquez saw something she had never expected to see, directed at humanity. Fear. You are not what we expected, the architect said quietly. You are something new. Why? And we do not yet know what this means. Vasquez smiled. It was an impolite smile. It was the smile of a species that had been underestimated throughout its entire history. It means, she said, we are just getting started. 6 weeks after the fall of the Nexus, the galaxy began to stabilize. Not because things were getting better in many places, they were still worsening, but because the initial shock had passed. The screaming had stopped, the chaos had subsided, turning into something more dangerous. A grueling, exhausting fight for survival that tested every world as never before. And in the center of it all, like a heart pumping blood through a damaged body, was Earth. The Beacon Initiative, as Herrera called it, went far beyond its original scale. What had started as a few emergency relief missions became a network of human stations spanning the galaxy, providing food, medicine, communications, and technical support to hundreds of worlds. Human ships were constantly moving between systems, carrying supplies and specialists. Human engineers repaired broken infrastructure. Human doctors treated alien wounds. Human farmers taught alien species how to feed themselves. Human negotiators settled disputes between factions ready to go to war. It was messy. It was exhausting. It held together on determination and nothing more, and it worked. But it was also creating something that Ambassador Elena Okafor-Singh had feared from the very beginning: dependency. She saw it in the way alien leaders spoke to her. Now, the Veil, who had once barely acknowledged humanity's existence, sent daily requests to Earth for advice on everything from agricultural policy to urban planning. The Dry Mori, slowly recovering under Amina's care, had started treating human psychologists as integral members of their communities, not as temporary visitors. Even the fractured Shogun factions had started using human mediators as a permanent feature of their negotiations. The galaxy wasn't recovering by itself. It was recovering around Earth. And this was exactly the trap that had destroyed every previous civilization. Elena realized it because she had spent her career studying the Nexus. It had always seemed strange to her that such a powerful system was adopted so completely by every species in the galaxy. Now she understood why. The Nexus didn't force anyone to depend on it. It was simply so good, so reliable, so convenient that refusing independence seemed like the obvious choice. Why struggle when someone else can do it for you? Why maintain your own systems when a better system is available? And now, humanity was becoming the new Nexus, not out of malice, not out of ambition, but out of kindness, out of responsiveness, out of a simple, natural human desire to fix things. Every time a human engineer repaired an alien system, every time a human ship delivered food to a starving world, every time a human diplomat resolved a dispute, it was good, it was necessary, it was right. And it was also making the galaxy dependent on Earth. She shared her concerns with Secretary General Herrera in a private message. He listened carefully. His face was grim on the screen. "You are right," he said. "I have been thinking the same thing. But what do we do? Stop helping?" "No," Elena said. "We help differently. We stop doing things for them and start teaching them to do things for themselves. And then we step back. It will be a difficult choice. Humans like being needed," Herrera said. "I know," Elena said. "That's why it's so dangerous." While Elena and Herrera struggled with the philosophical problem, the political problem was growing teeth. Admiral Yuki Tanaka hadn't stopped advocating for her position. In fact, the events of the last 6 weeks, in her view, proved she was right. Earth had stretched itself to a dangerous degree. Resources were being consumed at an unsustainable rate, human volunteers were burning out, and the galaxy, instead of becoming more self-sufficient, was becoming more dependent on human support. But Tanaka's argument had evolved. She was no longer just saying that Earth should stop helping. She was saying something more complex and more seductive. "We have already taken up the burden," she told the Star Council on an emergency session. "We cannot abandon it now without causing even more harm. Millions of beings depend on our supply lines. If we stop support, worlds will starve, factions will go to war, the recovery of the Dry Mori will collapse." She paused, letting the logic settle. "So, the question is not whether we should lead. We are already leading. The question is whether we will lead well or poorly. And leading well means having a structure, a system, authority." She didn't use the word empire. She didn't have to. The chamber was quiet, and in that silence, Elena heard the sound of something dangerous being born, not in the angry voices of extremists, but in the reasonable, measured, thoughtful voice of a woman who genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. That was what made it so terrifying. Tanaka wasn't a villain. She was a patriot who saw a problem and offered a logical solution, and her solution had the terrible advantage of being simple. Taking control was easy. Building an empire was easy, especially when your subjects were begging you to do it, because that was the other side of the equation. Alien species weren't just passively accepting human help, many of them were actively asking for human management. The Vale Council, for example, had formally offered Earth a supervisory role in their reconstruction, a polite request for humans to make decisions for them. 3 Shokun factions had offered to swear fealty to Earth in exchange for protection. Even the Dry Mori, through their recovering councils, had suggested that human psychologists be given permanent authority over their mental health systems. The galaxy wasn't just falling into human hands, it was climbing into them. And on Earth, the public was divided. Polls showed roughly 40% of people supported some form of permanent galactic leadership. Another 30% were against, and the remaining 30% were unsure. The arguments on both sides were passionate. Supporters pointed to the fact that humanity had earned this position through sacrifice and service. Opponents pointed to the fact that becoming what they had replaced was the oldest mistake in history. The debate reached its peak on a cold Tuesday morning in the hall of the Star Council. Herrera called a full session to decide Earth's long-term strategy. All council members were present. The gallery was filled with observers, journalists, diplomats, military officers, and citizen representatives. The entire planet was watching. Tanaka spoke first. She was calm, precise, and devastatingly logical. "I am not proposing conquest," she said. "I am proposing responsibility. The galaxy needs a center. It needs coordination. It needs a single point of stability around which recovery can organize itself. We didn't ask for this role. It was forced upon us by circumstances. But to abandon it now would be cowardice disguised as humility." She laid out her plan. Galactic leadership, under human guidance, managing trade routes, coordinating defense, and overseeing reconstruction. Every species would retain internal autonomy but would be subject to Earth in interstellar matters. "It is not an empire," she insisted. "It is a partnership where humanity is the senior partner." The applause from her supporters was long and loud. Then Elena stood. She had spent the previous night preparing her response. She had written drafts and thrown them away. She had walked her quarters until the floor felt thin. And in the end, she abandoned her notes and decided to speak from the heart. "Admiral Tanaka is right about one thing," she began. "The galaxy needs leadership. It needs coordination. It needs stability. She is right that we have earned the trust we have been given. And she is right that walking away now would cause huge harm. But she is wrong about the solution. And she is wrong for a reason that, I think, every person here already understands in their gut." She took a breath. "We know what happened to the galaxy. We know about the Crucible. We know that every civilization before us was given the same test, and every one of them failed. And do you know why they failed? Not because they were weak, not because they were stupid. They failed because they replaced one dependency with another. The Nexus fell, and they found something else to depend on. A strong species, a powerful leader, an empire that promised to take care of them. And for a while, it worked. And then, a few thousand years later, a new Crucible came, and they fell again because they had learned nothing. The hall was very quiet. If we accept what Tanaka proposes, we will become the new Nexus. Not a machine this time, but the effect will be the same. The galaxy will organize around us. It will depend on us. It will forget how to live on its own again. And the next time a crisis comes, and a crisis always comes, it will collapse again. And this time, it will take us down with it. She stepped closer to the center of the chamber. I didn't spend 6 weeks watching alien species learn how to plant seeds, how to breathe on their own, and how to make peace with their neighbors, only for us to make them dependent on us instead of a machine. That is not leadership. That is a cage painted to look like a shelter. She paused. I know what real leadership looks like. I have seen it in a Brazilian woman kneeling in the dirt on an alien world, teaching a creature 10 times her age how to grow food. I have seen it in a Kenyan captain who treated a proud species with dignity, not pity. I have seen it in a Somali doctor who taught a broken mind how to breathe. That is leadership. Not control, not power, not a seat at the top of the hierarchy. Leadership is teaching someone how to stand on their own and then stepping away. She looked directly at Tanaka, not with anger, but with respect. Admiral, you are one of the best officers Earth has ever produced, and your plan would work. For a while, maybe for a long time. But it would end the same way every empire ends, the same way the Nexus ended, and we would learn nothing, and the galaxy would learn nothing. And 1,000 years from now, some other species will be standing in some other hall, having this exact same conversation. She turned to the full council. I propose something harder. I propose that instead of becoming the galaxy's leader, we become its teachers. We share everything we know, our technology, our agriculture, our medicine, our conflict resolution, our history, all of it, freely and without conditions. We help every species build their own independent systems, their own food production, their own communication networks, their own defense, their own government. And then we step back. Not because we don't care, but because we care enough to let them struggle. She paused again. I call it the Pact of Campfires. No great bonfire around which everyone gathers, that was the Nexus, and it will be an empire. 1,000 little campfires, each independent, each stubborn, each burning on its own fuel. That is what the galaxy needs. Not another center, not another system to depend on. A galaxy of worlds that can each stand alone and choose to stand together. The silence that followed was massive. It filled the hall like water filling a glass, pressing against the walls, rising to the ceiling. Then Secretary General Herrera stood. She grew up in a small town in Colombia, he said. My mother was a doctor. She ran a clinic with almost nothing, and she told me something when I was young that I never forgot. She said, Tomas, a good doctor heals people. A great doctor teaches people to heal themselves. He turned to the council. I propose we accept Ambassador Okafor-Singh's proposal, the Pact of Campfires. Not because it is easy, it is the hardest thing we could possibly do, but because it is right. The vote was taken. It was not close. Tanaka's proposal had strong support from the military bloc and some industrial representatives, but the rest of the council, moved by Elena's words and Herrera's support, voted for the pact. Tanaka accepted the result with dignity. She was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. But after the vote, she approached Elena in the hallway. Do you understand what you have done? Tanaka said. We did this, Elena corrected. Tanaka winced. I opposed this. I fought you every step of the way, and then you built the defensive network that made it possible. Without your work, the pact would have been destroyed by the first pirate fleet that showed up. Tanaka paused for a moment. I still think an empire would have been more efficient. You are probably right. But efficiency isn't the point. No, Elena said quietly. It isn't. Tanaka nodded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Those two women had spent 5 years on opposite sides of the most important dispute in human history, and both of them had changed. Tanaka learned that power didn't require control. Elena learned that idealism without steel is just a dream. Together, they had built something neither of them could have built alone. The announcement of the Pact of Campfires spread across the galaxy within hours. The reaction was mixed. Some species accepted it immediately, recognizing the wisdom of building independent strength. Others were confused or even frightened. They had hoped Earth would take control. The idea of being responsible for themselves was terrifying. But on Ocean, Captain Duran Wangi received the news and felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: relief. He had been overseeing the reconstruction of the Vale agricultural system, a massive project that consumed every waking hour of his day. The Vale were learning fast. Kael, the young Vale who had watched the first sprouts with wonder, had become one of the program's most dedicated students. She worked alongside Maria Santos every day. Her 4 arms moved across the soil with increasing confidence. Her questions were becoming sharper and more insightful. But Duran had worried that the learning would stop, that once the crisis stabilized, the Veil would quietly ask the humans to keep running things, that the partnership would become a dependency, as it always had. The Pact of Campfires changed that. It set a date, a timeline, a clear point when human teams would hand over control and withdraw. The Veil had to be ready, and that deadline, that pressure, was exactly what they needed. On the day of the Pact's announcement, Duran gathered the Veil agricultural team for a meeting. He stood before a group of creatures who towered over him, creatures whose civilization was older than human history, creatures who had been taught agriculture by a species they once thought was barely civilized. "The Pact of Campfires has been approved," he said. "You know what this means? In 6 months, our team is going home. Everything we have built here, the farms, the irrigation systems, the storage facilities, will be yours. Completely yours. We will not run this for you. We will not control this for you. We are handing it over, and you will do it yourselves." He looked at their faces. He saw fear. He saw doubt. But underneath that, stubborn and growing, he saw determination. "Will you be able to do it?" he said. "I know you can because I have watched you learn. I have watched you go from not knowing what a seed is to growing your own food in 6 weeks. That is extraordinary. That is strength. Not our strength. Yours." KL stepped forward. Her silvery skin caught the light of the human-made lamps that still lit the hall. "We will be ready," she said, and her voice did not tremble. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a river finding a new course after a landslide. On world after world, human teams began the slow process of transferring knowledge and control to the local population. It was painful. It was messy. There were failures, crops that didn't yield, communication systems that collapsed, negotiations that failed. Some species suffered greatly, some fell back into chaos and needed human intervention again. But the direction was clear. The galaxy was not being saved. It was being taught how to save itself. And the architects watched from their ancient place in the heart of the galaxy. They watched with senses no other species could comprehend. They saw the Crucible play out countless times before. They saw civilizations rise to fill the vacuum left by the Nexus. Strong species, smart species, species that built empires and called it salvation. And every time the pattern repeated, dependency grew around a new center. The new center became a new Nexus. And when the next Crucible came, everything collapsed again. They had expected humanity to follow the same pattern. The logic was simple. Humanity was the strongest surviving species. The galaxy was weak. Strength fills weakness. That was the law of every civilization they had ever observed. But humanity had done something unprecedented. It had looked at the open door to empire and walked the other way. Not out of weakness, not out of naivety, but out of a clear understanding that concentrated power is power waiting for failure. The architects conferred among themselves. They hadn't conferred on a decision in over 10 years. There had never been a reason. The pattern always played out the same way. "They are teaching," said one of the architects, as if the concept was difficult to grasp. "They are leaving," said another. "They have the power to stay, and they choose to leave. This has never happened before." No, it has not. They watched and waited, because for the first time in their immeasurably long existence, they didn't know what would happen next. And that, perhaps, was the most human thing of all. 5 years. That was how long it took. 5 years of struggle and failure and slow, stubborn progress. 5 years of dirt under fingernails and sleepless nights and arguments that went nowhere and small victories that meant everything. 5 years since the Nexus died and the galaxy fell, and a little blue planet refused to let the darkness win. The galaxy that emerged from those 5 years was not the galaxy that had existed before. It was rougher, louder, less elegant. The smooth, seamless perfection of the Nexus era was gone, replaced by what appeared to an untrained eye to be chaos. Communication networks that used 12 different standards because 12 different species built them independently. Trade routes that zigzagged inefficiently because each sector developed its own path. Ships that looked nothing like each other because they were built by hands that had never built ships before. By every metric of the old galaxy, this would have been chaos. And it was also alive, more alive than the galaxy had been in 100,000 years. Ambassador Elena Okafor-Singh stood at the window of the newly built packed hall on the station once called the Hearth. The station had been rebuilt, not restored to its former grandeur, but rebuilt into something new. The old Hall of Accord, with its perfect symmetry and thousands of screens, was gone. In its place was a hall that was intentionally, almost stubbornly, imperfect. The walls were made of materials donated by different species: Vale crystal next to Shokun metal, next to human concrete, next to dry Mori living stone. No two sections matched, and the lighting was uneven. The acoustics were terrible. It was the most beautiful room Elena had ever seen. Today was the first full session of the Pact of Campfires. Representatives of over 300 species had gathered, not the 4,000 of the old Accord, because many civilizations were still recovering and couldn't spare delegates. But 300, that was a beginning. 300 was extraordinary, considering that 5 years ago, most of these species couldn't feed themselves. Elena looked at those gathered and felt a complex mixture of pride and exhaustion. She was 57 years old. The last 5 years had aged her in a way the previous 40 hadn't. Her hair was silvered. Her hands sometimes shook when she was tired, which was almost all the time. She had spent 5 years carrying a burden no human had carried before, and it showed, but she was still standing. That was the main thing. The session opened with a ceremony proposed by the Vale, the species that 5 years ago couldn't have organized a ceremony without human help. Now they ran it themselves, with only a few small mistakes that no one mentioned. A young Vale named Kale lit a flame in the center of the hall. Not a holographic flame, not an energy projection. A real flame, burning real fuel, giving off real heat. The Vale had learned fire from humans. They had never needed it before. Now they considered it sacred. "One fire," Kale said. Her voice carried through the imperfect acoustics of the imperfect hall. "One fire to start, but by the end of this session, every delegation will light its own. Not from this one, but from fuel they brought themselves, because that is the pact. We do not share one fire, each carries their own." The delegations murmured in approval. Some of them had already started unpacking the materials they had brought: tiny torches, chemical lanterns, bioluminescent spheres, and a dozen other light sources. Each was different. Each reflected the species that created it. Elena watched and felt her throat tighten. She remembered the early days, the desperate messages filling her communicator, the empty hall, the terrible burden of being the only light in the galaxy. She remembered thinking it was too much, that humanity was too small, that the darkness was too vast. She had been wrong not about the darkness. The darkness was exactly as vast as she had feared. She had been wrong about humanity being too small. It turned out that small didn't mean weak. It turned out that one steadily held candle could show others where to find their own. The session continued its agenda. Trade agreements were reached, clumsy, complex agreements between species, still learning how to deal with each other without a central system managing everything. Defense protocols were discussed. A decentralized network that Admiral Tanaka had been building for the last 4 years, a system where every species maintained its own defensive forces, but could call on others for mutual aid. Agricultural reports were presented, and Elena was quietly amazed by the numbers. Most species that were on the brink of starvation 5 years ago were now feeding themselves. Not always well, in some cases inefficiently, but independently. The galaxy was learning to stand on its own feet, and it was doing so in the most wonderfully chaotic way. During a break in the session, Elena walked the station's corridors and stopped at a window-facing space. She stopped and stared. The view was different from what she remembered. 5 years ago, the space around the hearth had been dark. Navigation beacons were dead. Communication repeaters were silent. Trade ships were frozen in place. Now, space was busy. Ships of all shapes and sizes moved along new and still-to-be-mapped routes. Communication satellites flashed signals using a dozen different protocols. A Vale agricultural transport passed close to a Shokun patrol ship, and neither of them shot at each other, and neither needed a central authority to tell them not to. They just passed. One species went about its business and the other went about its own. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, it was alive. Elena was still standing at the window when a familiar voice sounded behind her. "You look tired." She turned and saw Duran in uniform. He had retired from active service 2 years ago after overseeing the final transfer of the Vale agricultural system. Now he wore civilian clothes, and his face had the weathered look of someone who had spent a lot of time outside, which he had. He now lived on Oashin, running a joint Vale human school of agriculture. The school had started with 12 students, and now it had over 1,000. I am tired, Elena admitted, but it's a good kind of tired, the kind you've earned. Duran smiled. I know that kind of tiredness. How is the school growing? Literally, in the last season, we had our biggest harvest. KL, remember KL? She's our head instructor now. She's a better farmer than most of my human graduates. Elena shook her head in amazement. The same Kale who 5 years ago didn't know what a seed was? The same. She told me something last month that I can't stop thinking about. She said that learning to grow food changed how her species thinks about time. Before this, the Vale planned in terms of centuries and millennia. Everything was long-term, abstract, distant. But agriculture forced them to think in terms of seasons, weeks, days, the time between planting and harvest. She said it made everything more real, more present, more alive. That's beautiful. It is, and it's terrifying for them. To feel time passing, to feel the urgency of every season that is new. But KL says it's also a gift. She says the Vale thought about eternity for so long they forgot to think about today. And today is where food grows. They stood together at the window for a while, watching the ships pass. I heard from Amina, Duran said. Did you read her book? Elena had read it. The book was titled Broken and Restored, a Universal Theory of Resilience, and it had become the most translated text in galactic history. Dr. Amina Yusuf had written it over 3 years, drawing from her experience with the dry Mori and a deep study of how different species, including humans, processed and recovered from trauma. The book's main argument was simple and powerful. Resilience wasn't a trait some species had and others didn't. It was a skill, a practice, a muscle that became stronger with use. The dry Mori had lost their resilience because they hadn't needed it for millennia. Humanity had kept its resilience because it had never stopped needing it. But the important part, the part that made the book so widely read, was Amina's conclusion. Resilience could be taught. Any species at any stage of its development could develop the ability to break and rebuild. It wasn't a human monopoly. It was a universal ability that just needed exercise. And the book gave the galaxy what it had been desperately lacking: hope based on evidence, not empty wishes. The dry Mori are using it as the foundation for their new educational system, Duran said. Every dry Mori child now learns individual resilience alongside collective consciousness. They are rebuilding their telepathic network, but slowly, carefully, and they ensure every individual can function alone before joining the collective. Amina must be pleased. She is pleased, although she would never say so. You know what she's like. Elena knew. Amina Yusuf was the kind of person who did extraordinary things and then looked slightly embarrassed when someone made a fuss. The afternoon session brought a moment Elena had both expected and feared: the election of the first chair of the pact. She had known for months that she would be nominated. She had also known for months what she would do. But knowing something and doing it were different things. And when the vote was taken and her name was announced, she felt a wave of emotion that nearly knocked her off her feet. She stood before the assembly of 300 species, each represented by beings who had fought, suffered, and survived to be here today, and accepted the position with a brief speech. I am immensely honored, she said, and I accept this responsibility with one condition. This position will rotate between species every 5 years. I will serve my term, and then I will step down, and someone from another world will take this chair. Not because I want to leave, but because the Pact of Campfires is not about one species leading. It is about every species having the opportunity to lead. The assembly voted to accept the condition. It was unanimous. Tanaka was in the gallery. She had been invited as a guest, the architect of the Pact's defensive network, a system that was now considered one of the most innovative military structures in galactic history. It was a completely decentralized system with no single command, no central fleet. Instead, each species maintained its own defensive forces and contributed to a framework of mutual aid that could be activated by any member in a crisis. It was the military equivalent of the Pact itself. Thousands of little forces that could act together without depending on each other. After the session, Tanaka approached Elena for the second time in 5 years. How did you do it? Tanaka said. We did this, Elena corrected. Tanaka winced. I opposed this. I fought you every step of the way, and then you built the defensive network that made it possible. Without your work, the Pact would have been destroyed by the first pirate fleet that showed up. Tanaka paused for a moment. I still think an empire would have been more efficient. You are probably right, but efficiency isn't the point. No, Elena said quietly. It isn't. Tanaka nodded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Those two women had spent 5 years on opposite sides of the most important dispute in human history, humanity, and both of them had changed. Tanaka learned that power didn't require control. Elena learned that idealism without steel is just a dream. Together, they had built something neither of them could have built alone. The final address of the session was made by Secretary General Herrera. He was older now. His hair was completely gray. His face was etched with the weight of the decisions he had made. But his eyes were still kind, and his voice still carried the warmth of the son of a small-town Colombian doctor who believed that helping others wasn't just a duty, but a privilege. He stood in the center of the imperfect hall, surrounded by the light of 300 different campfires, and spoke. 5 years ago, the galaxy collapsed overnight. The systems that held it together vanished, and 4,000 civilizations found themselves alone in the dark. Many of you were afraid, many of you despaired, and many of you looked at a small, young, stubborn species on an unremarkable planet and asked for help. He paused. We helped not because we were the best, not because we were the smartest, not because we had some special quality making us superior to any of you. We helped because that is what you do when someone falls. You reach out a hand. He looked around the hall, at the faces of the beings he had spent 5 years with, their hopes, their fears, their extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable loss. But the help we gave was unimportant. What mattered was what happened after. What mattered was watching each of you learn to stand on your own feet, watching the Veil grow their first harvest, watching the Dry Mori rebuild their minds, watching the Shokun choose peace when war would have been easier, watching species that had been dependent for millennia rediscover their strength. His voice grew softer, but somehow carried further. We were never the heroes of this story. We were the match. You are the fire. Each of you burns independently, by your own choice, on your own fuel. This is not our achievement, it is yours. And we could not be prouder than to stand among you, not above you, not ahead of you among you, as one fire among many. He stepped back, and the hall exploded not with polished applause, but with something roaring. The stomping of feet, the clapping of tentacles, the beating of wings, voices raised in sounds of joy in hundreds of different languages. It was the sound of a galaxy that had nearly perished and chose to live. In the packed hall, 300 different lights burned. No two were alike. Some were bright, some were dim. Some flickered, some burned steadily. Some gave off heat, some only light. But all of them burned. Everyone. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to find its new rhythm. It wasn't a smooth rhythm. It stumbled, coughed, and sometimes fell completely out of sync. Trade disputes flared up and were resolved poorly, then resolved again, slightly less poorly. Communication networks collapsed and were rebuilt. Old grudges between species surfaced and had to be resolved through messy, imperfect diplomacy instead of perfect machine-managed mediation. It was, by every measure, a work in progress, and it was glorious. Duran Wangi returned to Oashin, to his school of agriculture. Kale and Saron Vel, the senior Veil who had given the famous speech about human stubbornness, had become close friends as only two people who had survived something unthinkable together could. They sat together in the evenings on the porch of Duran's small house, looking out over fields that hadn't existed 5 years ago, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, Saron asked Duran a question that had long been troubling him. Do you believe this will last? This pact? This new way? Duran thought about it. He thought about human history, the empires that had risen and fallen, the civilizations that had thrived and collapsed, the endless cycle of building and destruction that defined his species. No, he said honestly, not forever. Nothing lasts forever. Something will go wrong. Eventually, there will be a crisis, a war, a catastrophe, something we cannot foresee. Saron looked troubled. Then what was the point? The point, Duran said, leaning back in his chair and looking at the stars, is that when everything goes wrong, you will know how to survive it. You will know how to grow food and build shelters and talk to each other and start over. You will know these things because you learned them not from the Nexus, not from us. You learned them by doing them yourselves, with your own hands. He looked at Saron. That is what the Veil lost when they gave everything to the Nexus. Not technology, not knowledge. You lost the experience of the struggle. And the struggle is the only teacher that matters, because the struggle is the only thing the universe will never stop giving you. Saron was silent for a long time. Then he said, Your species has a strange relationship with suffering. We do, Duran agreed. We hate it when it happens, and we are grateful for it when it ends. It is very confusing. Saren made a sound Duran had learned to recognize as laughter. You humans are all completely insane. Yes, Duran said, smiling, but it works. And in a hidden place in the heart of the galaxy, the architects gathered for the last time. They gathered in their ancient hall, a structure that had existed since the first star formed in the galaxy. They were old, immeasurably so. They had seen life emerge from primordial seas on a million worlds. They had built the Nexus as a tool and as a test. They had seen civilizations rise, depend, and fall again and again over cycles that stretched back to the beginning of time. They had designed the Crucible because they believed that true resilience was the only quality worth measuring. A galaxy of dependent species was a galaxy waiting for death. Only a species, or a galaxy, that could survive the loss of everything it depended on was worthy of continuing. And in every previous cycle, every civilization had failed. Some had failed immediately, dissolving into chaos and extinction. Others had lasted longer, building empires that mimicked the Nexus and fell in the next cycle. None of them had ever done what humanity had done. None had ever chosen to teach instead of rule. None had ever voluntarily surrendered power to make others stronger. None had ever looked at a galaxy full of weakness and seen not subjects to rule, but students to teach, and then partners to stand alongside. The eldest of the architects spoke. Its voice resonated through the ancient hall with the weight of countless years. Update the record, it said. The Crucible has been administered. The result is unprecedented. The primary surviving species chose the distribution of resilience instead of the concentration of power. Galactic civilization is recovering on a distributed, independent model with no single point of failure. It paused. The other architects waited. The Crucible, it said, has been passed. There was silence. A silence that lasted, it seemed, an eternity. What do we do now? Asked another architect. It was a question that had never been asked before because the answer had always been the same. Reset the Nexus, begin the next cycle, wait another 100 years. But this time, the answer was different. We watch, said the eldest. We watch what they build, not because we expect them to fail, but because for the first time in our existence, we genuinely do not know what will happen next. And that was something worth watching. Far from the galactic core, on a small world in the outer spiral of the quiet galaxy, a child looked up at the sky. She wasn't human. She was a dry Mori, one of the first generation born after the fall of the Nexus. She was 7 years old, and she was extraordinary in a way that would have been impossible before the collapse. She could think as an individual. She could also join the collective. She could do both, switching between them as easily as a human child switches between playing alone and playing with friends. She was something new, something that had never existed before, an individual who chose to be part of a whole, rather than a whole that had never known individuality. So, she stood on the hill behind her home and looked at the night sky. The sky was full of stars, as always. But now, among the stars, there were other lights. Tiny, blinking, multicolored lights, communication satellites, navigation beacons, repeaters, dozens of them, built by dozens of different species, each one a little different from the others. Her mother stood beside her and pointed to the lights. "Do you see those?" her mother asked. "Yes, what are they?" "They are campfires," her mother said. "Every species in the galaxy carries its own now. They keep them burning so that no matter what happens, no matter how dark it gets, there will always be light somewhere." The child looked at the sky with wide, wondering eyes. Why do they all look different? Because every species built its own. When no one told them how to do it, they figured it out themselves. That is why some of them flicker. Her mother paused for a moment. Yes, some of them are still learning. Who taught them? Her mother paused again. Then she told the story. She told it the way all species in the galaxy had started telling it, not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a memory. She told her daughter about the night the galaxy fell, about the silence that followed, about the small, stubborn species on a small, stubborn world that never stopped keeping candles next to a fusion reactor. She told her about the humans who came on their battered ships with grain, tools, and fire, who taught a galaxy that had forgotten how to struggle that the struggle was the most important thing a living creature could do. Who had been offered an empire and chose to be teachers instead, who lit the first fire and then spent 5 years making sure everyone else could light their own. The child listened to every word. And when the story ended, she looked at the sky again, at the hundreds of different lights. Each burned independently, each burned stubbornly, each burned because someone had chosen to keep it alive. "I want to build a light too," she said. Her mother placed a hand on her daughter's head. "Then you will." And the child smiled and reached for the stars, and the campfires continued to burn. All of them. Each one. Not because someone told them to, but because they chose to.